Alrighty, welcome to Roundtable Decision. And this is my first ever live stream, so we'll kind of see how it goes. And I'm attempting something I've never really done before, as obviously this is the first ever live stream. But I'm going to try to understand the new bill, what got passed by the Senate with the COVID-19 stimulus relief bill. And obviously it's been kind of talked about in news clips, or if you followed any news recently about how much $2 trillion are, and it's just a massive bill what a lot of Republicans are worried about, and a lot of Democrats didn't think had enough to it, although it did pass with no votes, as the Senate largely saw this bill as being 100% needed for the American people. But before I kind of get really started into it, we all know about COVID-19 and how it's impacted our lives. So I think everyone has been impacted by it in some form or shape. I myself am a grocery store employee, so I have had a lot of overtime hours and have worked a lot, while as my family hasn't always had that same case with getting reduced workload or just having to work from home, which is rather bizarre, as seeing the grocery store type of employee become more and more needed than really just being a regular entry-level type of job. But as we all know, COVID-19 has also been in the news largely, and I just searched news and went on Google, and as you see scrolling around, you see COVID-19 as being the biggest story out of every single topic, including that new cruise ship which had to get shut down because of quarantine, and a few patients who, what I believe, died or got sick. So that Florida ship was not allowed to dock because of COVID-19. And obviously we all know that coronavirus has really taken the word for a show, so to speak. And I made a video about the first bill that didn't get passed by the Senate floor, and then later, I believe 2 days later, it did get passed with Republican senators, mainly like Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and Susan Collins, and John Kennedy, even though I had that wrong in my video. It's either John or Robert, John Kennedy. Anyway, long story short, didn't really like the bill as it had a lot of other issues that Republicans didn't really find as being necessary, such as greenhouse gas emissions and reducing airlines to a certain carbon emissions. Like when your airline ticket comes out, it would have your carbon emissions for that plane ride and what that would do to the environment relative to the situation as a whole. But as I've talked about, the main purpose of today's live stream and today's video is talking about the COVID-19 bill and trying to understand the bill that did get passed. So, as CNN states here in its first article, Trump signs a historic $2 trillion stimulus bill after Congress passes it Friday. It's $2 trillion. I think I said $2 billion earlier. Anyway, President Trump signed into Friday afternoon a historic $2 trillion stimulus package as the American public and U.S. economy fight the devastating spread of COVID-19. The far-reaching legislation stands as the largest emergency aid package in U.S. history. It represents a massive financial injection into a struggling economy, which provisions aimed at helping American workers, small businesses, and industries grappling with the economic disruption. So as you see with the average video and the average talk about the stimulus bill as a whole, it talked about how it was going to help the average American and most importantly the average business. And in a lot of ways, I kind of heard YouTubers and like Twitter kind of mocking Trump's idea, even though it wasn't necessarily Trump's idea, but the idea of the bill as a Andrew Yang type of opposition, as that is exactly what Andrew Yang was wanting to do with Americans, and this bill has kind of stolen that idea to use as a whole to help the American people. And as I'll continue reading here, the House of Representatives earlier that day approved the bill that passed the Senate earlier this week, overcoming last-minute drama by using the unusual procedural move to thwart a demand by a conservative Republican to force members to vote in person. So that was another thing. They were at one point wanting to vote, you could say digitally, where they didn't have to show up on the Senate floor due to concerns of the coronavirus, as a Republican representative ended up getting getting the coronavirus. And so they didn't necessarily want that to happen to them. And Ted Cruz at one point was also self-quarantined, as he shook hands with someone who ended up testing positive from coronavirus. But as a whole, they didn't necessarily want to meet due to fear of that. But that bill and the idea allowed them to show up in the House to vote for the bill. And it got passed with no votes, as we read here. The Republican Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky infiltrated members in both parties by bringing them back to Washington, aimed uncertainty over whenever he would request a full roll call vote that uncertainly forced many to travel during a public health emergency simply to deny his demand in order to ensure swift passage of the measure on Friday. And as I scroll down a little more, a quadrilateral of the House, 260 members, was needed to block Massie's attempt. Massie made a point in order that a quadrilateral, and I don't think I'm saying it right, but anyway, was not present, but it was determined that was in fact present and motion was adopted. So they returned to D.C. As you can, the CNN article is kind of like a timeline, and I'll scroll down here. Key provisions in the stimulus. In 1 second, I'm sending out a live tweet here. Okay. Anyway, a centerpiece of the stimulus package is that it will provide direct financial assistance to Americans in the form of checks with an amount received based on income. Individuals who earn $75,000 in adjusted gross income or less will get a direct payment of $1,200 each, with married couples earning up to $150,000 receiving $2,400 and an additional $500 per each child. The payment would scale down by income, phasing out entirely at $99,000 for singles and $198,000 for couples without children. In addition, the bill would provide billions of dollars in aid to hit hospitals struggling to deal with outbreaks, as well as for state and local governments that are cash strapped due to their response to coronavirus. One point of contention in negotiations centered for a fund for distressed industries, with Democrats worrying that there would not be adequate oversight in a comprehensive move. The final deal provides for accountability through an independent inspector general and congressional oversight panel. So those are the people who are going to be ruling what amount of aid you might receive, or any aid at all. And so there's kind of like four main focuses to the bill as a whole, as I kind of talked about a little earlier. There's to help small businesses, to help individuals, to help hospitals, and other unreally involved agendas that a lot of Republicans try to claim as being wrong. As stated earlier, there was a big agenda in the earlier bill to pass a green initiative, which didn't really end up getting seen in the bill as a whole, and a lot of Democrats saw that as a lost opportunity within the bill. And having a green agenda, although is important, a lot of people I don't think saw that it was necessary to the COVID-19 bill as a whole, but should happen later on. And I tend to agree with that perspective as a whole, depending on what happens from now on. So I decided to pull up this article here, as I thought it gave a full kind of faster breakdown of what it particularly is in the bill as a whole. And so it's a breakdown of the COVID-19 bill. So here is kind of what it all defines as in the bill, or at least the main highlights that a lot of people in news and other medias have been talking about. It ensures that all testing for COVID-19 is covered by private insurance plans, with free coverage of a vaccine within 15 days for COVID-19, when such a vaccine is available. So obviously the vaccines are not available yet, but once they are available, it is highly important that they get used to save lives and to help further COVID-19 patients from getting it in the future. But as a large part of people have talked about, like Ben Shapiro and other kind of YouTubers and other alternative media and even media as a whole have talked about how tests need to start getting used more often. So testing for COVID-19 is highly important in order to understand the highly impacted areas besides highly populated areas like New York, which are bound to happen due to how close people are living next to each other. But it's important that this COVID-19 testing gets used because it could define more sense of how COVID-19 is impacting the United States, such as if COVID-19 testing were to become regular, it could pop up in places in Texas that weren't necessarily expected to have popped up before in counties, and that can go for any other state such as Montana, Georgia, Alabama, any smaller state what's more spread out. Just because it's spread out doesn't mean that there will be highly populated areas of patients that have COVID-19. It also states for eligible small businesses, sole proprietorships, independent contractors, and other self-employed individuals, the Act provides $349 billion. These loans can be used to pay for utilities, rent, mortgage, and payroll. Borrowers are eligible for loan forgiveness for the first 8 weeks of the loan. The Small Business Administration has no more than 15 days after that date to enact to issue regulations. The measure provides $500 billion to the Department of Treasury Exchange Stabilization Fund for use in loans, loan guarantees, and other investment for distressed businesses that do not qualify for the small business relief. This includes direct lending of $25 billion for passenger air carriers, $4 billion for cargo carriers, and $17 billion for businesses determined to be important to national security. The remaining $454 billion is eligible for direct lending to distressed businesses meeting a specific criteria. These provisions also include provisions on recipes of relief engage in stock buybacks, and all loans must be used to retain a perfect 90% of the workforce. I heard from somebody else, and I can't necessarily guarantee that this fact is true, as I would have to rewatch the video and reread the articles I read about it, but I heard that this bill is going to triple, and if it wasn't triple, it was double the amount of spending that the Department of Treasury has ever really spent before. And the only thing what's kind of recently relative to what this is doing, essentially what it's doing is sending out loans to help these small businesses or to help essential businesses keep surviving despite not making as much money as they were making before. And these loans haven't really ever been used before besides one instance. And this instance was in 2008, I believe, with either the housing crisis or the stock market crash or both. But these loans haven't really seen such a huge impact as they're possibly going to have with this COVID-19 bill. In other words, more people are available to have these loans than were in the past. And the amount of money these loans are going to require is going to substantially make the United States debt a lot larger. And a lot of people have worried about that, although these small businesses and essential businesses are much needed in order to keep the United States economy striving whenever this were to disappear. In other words, these important businesses need to stay open even if it means going into debt. A lot of people think that is a valid point. As I keep going. For those who lost employment because of the pandemic, the measure provides robust unemployment insurance, including for self-employed, independent contractors, and those with limited work history. The assistance will include an additional $600 per week for each recipient and provides an additional 13 weeks of benefits to those who remain unemployed after state unemployment benefits are no longer. So a lot of people were worried about this point of the bill as it was talking about unemployment insurance. And at one point they were talking about giving unemployment insurance along with the check the person was receiving. In other words, if someone was making less than what the unemployment insurance was giving them, they were still going to give them the unemployment insurance a lot of Democrats wanted. Because a lot of Democrats were thinking just because the unemployment insurance is more than the actual insurance doesn't mean that they shouldn't get the unemployment insurance. But Republicans were taking a slightly different perspective to the issue, as Republicans were saying if the unemployment insurance is more than they were actually making before, they shouldn't receive an amount that was higher, but rather receive the amount they were making before. So in other words, if you were only making $450 per week and the unemployment insurance is $600, you should only make $450 and not the $600. But Bernie Sanders and a few other senators didn't really like that perspective as a whole, as I believe Bernie Sanders was basically given a quote that says that that's BS. He didn't say those exact words, but that was kind of the sum of the quote itself. But rather he was talking about the perspective of just because somebody doesn't make as much money as the unemployment insurance would give them doesn't mean that they shouldn't get the money, and rather they will still want to work. As one of the articles, I believe, talks about a Lindsey Graham quote, as Lindsey Graham, a Republican senator, was basically like, if they're going to gain more money than the unemployment insurance, if the unemployment insurance is more money than what they were actually making, that's going to make the people who were making less not want to go back to work and just keep receiving the unemployment insurance. And therefore, that makes the drive to work less for the average American. And that's something Lindsey Graham was afraid of happening. And Bernie Sanders' response to that was rather, just because somebody's going to make more doesn't mean that their drive to work will go away. Americans still want to work. That was kind of his point. And depending where you line up on the perspective would mean where your point comes. And most often, if you're a Democrat, you're going to kind of lean in towards the Democratic perspective and the Bernie Sanders perspective, even though Bernie Sanders is highly progressive and the average Democrat may not align exactly with Bernie Sanders, his point kind of still stands on that perspective of the viewpoint. And that essentially is, just because you make more doesn't mean that you shouldn't receive it. But if you're a Republican, most likely you think more along the lines of Lindsey Graham, or if you're a conservative, you think more along the lines of Lindsey Graham, and you think that work should still be the main focus to the economy, and that's how the economy is going to improve. Therefore, you should make the drive to go back to work higher and give the person an amount of money he was receiving before and not more than what he was receiving before. U.S. individual taxpayers with an adjusted gross income of up to $75,000 or $150,000 joint are eligible for a full $1,200, $2,400 joint rebate and an additional rebate of $500 per child. Americans will not be required to do anything to receive a rebate check, as the IRS will use a taxpayer's 2019 tax return or their 2018 return if they have not yet filled. The rebate is reduced by $5 for each $100 of the taxpayer's income that exceeds $75,000 and completely phases out at $99,000. This sweeping measure is not likely to be the last action that the executive and legislative branches will undertake to defeat the virus and its punishing impact of the health and economic well-being of the nation. So as you can kind of see here, a lot of the articles on excuse me. Whew. A lot of the articles I'm showing here kind of say the same information as a whole, because that's the main focus of the bill and what they were trying to pass. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the bill was just this in itself. The bill was 880 pages long. Therefore, there's a lot more to the bill than just what a lot of the articles talk about, and a lot of the main points of the bill are a lot of what the bill wants to show as a whole, if that makes sense. I'm going to go here real quick. Check it. Okay. So it is there. Alrighty. Cool. I'll keep going. Oops. We'll get to that later. Alrighty. I was just making sure we were still up and going here. Alrighty. So this is kind of the main focus. And I thought NPR, which is rather bizarre, is their... which is rather bizarre that they have the most accurate details of the coronavirus as a whole. But they do. So we'll use them as the main example for how the bill's breakdown is and what all exactly is in the bill as a whole. So it's also being referred to as the CARES Act as a whole. So if I start using CARES Act instead of the COVID-19 stimulus bill or whatever, also verbiage I want to use just so we know that it's the same bill and the same phrase of exactly what it has been called. Anyway, as I was saying, individuals are estimated at a $560 billion portion of the bill. Public health is $153.5 billion of the bill. State and local governments is $339.8 billion. Small businesses are $377 billion, and big corporations are $500 billion. And education and other is $43.7 billion. And safety net is $26 billion. So they have a $26 billion safety. And those who don't know too much about economics or don't exactly know what safety net in this case refers to, it's basically the extra amount of money the bill is estimated to have. And although there's a $26 billion safety, the chances are that that safety is going to go away in one of these other bubbles, or one bubble, two bubbles, three bubbles, four, all bubbles. It's going to go away. Just because it's an estimated budget, most of the times when you estimate something, it doesn't end up going that direction. So just looking at the percentages, although there's not a percentage tab up, there's more an estimated in money tab up, you can still see how the breakdown went. So it went individuals as 1, big corporations as 2, small businesses as 3, state and local governments as 4, public health as 5, education and other as 6, and safety net as the other portion of the bill. So that's why a lot of headlines I saw and a lot of talk on YouTube and on news media, CNN, and even Fox kind of talked about the other perspective of what CNN was talking about, of course. But they were all kind of talking about how big corporations were a large part of the bill as a whole. And a lot of one article basically called that out. So I'll kind of talk about that detail in that article because it was rather harsh to the bill's backing of big corporations and giving corporations more power in a time of need where individuals need it more. Even though individuals is number 1 as the estimate, big corporations is number 2 right behind it. So a lot of people were angry at that. As I'll read from NPR. The Senate has passed a roughly $2 trillion coronavirus response bill intended to speed relief for costs in the American economy. This is the third aid package from Congress and is meant to keep businesses and individuals afloat during an unexpected freeze on a majority of American life. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell described the legislation known as the CARES Act as a necessary emergency relief and vowed to put partisanship aside to get it done. No economic policy can fully end the hardship, so as long as the public health requires that we put much of our commerce on ice, McConnell said in a speech on the Senate floor on Wednesday. This isn't even a stimulus package, it is an emergency relief. Emergency relief, that's what it is. There are 7 main groups that would see the widest reaching impacts: individuals, small businesses, big corporations, hospitals and public health, federal safety net, state and local governments, and education. Here's what each group can expect if the bill becomes law, which it has. Alrighty, individuals. The bill includes several elements aimed at helping to keep people engaged in the economy. That means direct cash for many, plus expanded unemployment benefits and new rules for things like filing your taxes and making retirement contributions. Cash payments estimated to total $300 billion. Most individuals earning less than $75,000 can expect a one-time cash payment of $1,200. Married couples would receive a check and families would get $500 per child. Again, a statistic we're very, very familiar with as of now. These checks start to phase down after that and disappear completely for people making more than $99,000 and couples making more than $198,000. And just real quick, the purpose of the check getting disappeared over a time period is making sure that people don't become reliant on a check as itself. The government was afraid if they kept giving people free money, so to speak, even though it's in a time of need, that they would become reliant on that cash and that free money. That is why welfare has become a huge topic in the past and isn't necessarily associated with as of now, but it's still a common debate tactic when you can hear with a lot of conservatives saying that welfare makes people lazy and a lot of Democrats saying that welfare is needed because poor people aren't lazy. And you have that common debate between the two, but that's kind of always been happening. Anyway, back to the article. The cash payments are based on either your 2018 or 2019 taxes. People who receive Social Security benefits but don't file tax returns are still eligible. They don't need to file taxes. The checks will be based on information provided by the Social Security Administration. Extra unemployment payments. The $260 billion estimated cost is subject to change based on the number of people filing for unemployment. So that was the big thing. So a lot of like restaurant workers and unessential jobs that kind of got fired, like school janitors because there's no school, or other type of people as a whole. This bill is becoming rather interesting as a perspective for those people because they're having to face a life decision on if they want to apply for these unemployment benefits. Because if they do, they'll have a rather interesting concern. So a lot of people were saying that if you're a restaurant worker and you're not working right now, that is very hard to keep going from now on. So they would apply for unemployment benefits. And taking the perspective of a Democrat and the bill comes to an end, that could put somebody at a very big problem for going forward. But anyway, as I go back, the bill makes major changes to unemployment assistance, increasing the benefits and broadening who is eligible. States will still continue to pay unemployment to people who qualify. That amount varies state by state, as does the amount of time people are allowed to claim it. So again, President Trump and the government as a whole has made a perspective of letting the states decide how they want to go about their COVID-19 response. So you have states like New York or California, with most importantly San Francisco, that go on complete lockdown and are arresting people that have more than 10 people at their house, like a house party, things like that. And that's become very, very important for that perspective as a whole. And you have I can't say his name right now. The governor of New York, Cuomo, that's it. Yes, the governor of New York saying that the lockdown they did might have not have been the best approach. And nobody really knows. And that's why the President Trump has given it up to the states. And the state of Texas and our Governor Abbott's decided to let it up to each of the counties and let their county commissioner or county judge decide what to do from there. But everybody is making these small decisions that group together as a whole and make that wide state decision. But each state is different, as you have like Texas and Florida, who are very much open compared to all the other states as a whole, and nobody really knows exactly if that's a good or bad thing, as there are not enough tests of COVID-19 to tell if Texas and Florida is smart or if New York or California is smart. And although New York and California are much more denser in population, you still have to assume the worst for states that are more wide open in order to hopefully have better than the worst. As I go back, The bill makes major changes to unemployment assistance, increasing the benefits and broadening who is eligible. States will continue to pay unemployment to people who qualify. That amount varies state by state, as does the amount of time people are allowed to claim it. The bill adds $600 per week from federal government on top of whatever base amount of worker receives on a state. That boosted payment will last for 4 months. For example, if an out-of-work person is receiving a national average of about $340 per week, under the new federal program, their take-home pay would be $940. This legislation also adds 13 weeks of unemployment insurance. People nearing the maximum number of weeks allowed by their state would get an extension. New fillers would be allowed to contact the benefits for the longer period. Gig workers and freelancers. Typically, self-employed people, freelancers, and contractors can apply for unemployment. This bill creates a new temporary pandemic unemployment assistance program through the end of this year to help people who work as a direct result of the public health emergency. Tax returns. Some people have not filled their 2019 tax returns, but that's okay. Filing deadline has been extended to July 15th. The IRS also says that people who have failed or plan to can expect to receive a refund if they are owed one. Student loans is also a topic within this bill, as it says employers can provide up to $5,250 in tax-free student loan repayment benefits. That means an employer could continue to loan payments and workers wouldn't have to include that money as income. So a broad sense of the bill is talking about relieving stress of the average person through financial in a time where finances have become a huge issue as a whole. As the next topic is small businesses, and small businesses have greatly been impacted by COVID-19, especially if your business is considered a non-essential business, which is still kind of harsh if your business is called non-essential, because really as a small business owner, all businesses are essential as that is your main income, and it being your main income therefore makes it essential to you because that's how you survive. But either way, it's considered to be non-essential, and they have to go from there. But a wider perspective, although it's on a side note, one more second here. Although it's on a side note, is that there isn't really that many businesses that aren't considered non-essential. But nail salons, hair salons, things where a lot of people gather and a lot of DNA is left over are considered to be non-essential as a whole. But I'm sure we all know what essential and non-essential business is right now. Anyway, the main features for small businesses are emergency grants and forgivable loan programs for companies with 500 or fewer employees. There are also changes to rules for expenses and deductions meant to make it easier for companies to keep employees on the payroll and stay open near term. Emergency grants. The bill provides $10 billion for grants up to $10,000 to provide emergency funds for small businesses to cover immediate operating cost. There is $350 billion allocated for small businesses administrations to provide loans for up to $10 billion per business. Any portion of that loan used to maintain payroll, keep workers on the books, or pay for rent, mortgage, and existing debt could be forgiven, provided workers stay employed through the end of June. Relief for existing loans. There is a $17 billion to cover 6 months of payments for small businesses already using SBA loans. The bill set aside roughly $500 billion in loans and other monies for big corporations. These companies will have to pay the government back and will be subject to public disclosures and other requirements. About $58 billion is allocated to help airlines stay open. One portion of that money is set up aside to help cover employee wages, salaries, and benefits, divided up to a $25 billion for passenger air carriers, up to $4 billion for cargo air carriers, and up to $3 billion for airline contractors. Stock buyback ban. Any company receiving a loan under the program is barred from marketing stock buybacks for the term of the loan plus 1 year. Reporting requirements. All loans, their terms, and any investors or other assistance provided by the government must be publicly disclosed. The bill creates a special inspector general to oversee pandemic recovery. That person, along with a special committee, would provide oversight of all loans and other uses of taxpayer dollars. No benefit for Trump. The president, vice president, and member of the cabinet and member of the Congress are borrowed from benefiting from the money carved out for corporations. That also extends to the spouse, house, son-in-law, or daughter-in-law. In other words, Congress is not allowed to pass bills just because of their self-motivation. That has kind of been a common thing in politics as a whole. There's a lot of laws that protect senators and government as a whole from being able to fraud the representatives they're supposed to be fair to. And one of those is self-interest. A representative isn't supposed to just vote because of their self-interest. They're supposed to vote on what the taxpayers of their area want them to vote as or want them to vote for. And that is very, very important. So making the bill pass for these senators and for president and anyone in the cabinet and not for them to benefit is important in a lot of ways because it leaves that self-motivation factor out. And that's something that is very important for politics to be left out of. Because again, politics is supposed to be for the people, but a lot of times we think senators are doing it just because of their self-motivation. And you can see that in a lot of senators and a lot of representatives in what they say and what they do once they actually get to the government, or what they don't do when they get to the government, as in a lot of senators and a lot of people. All businesses. The bill establishes a fully refundable tax credit for businesses of all sizes that are closed or distressed to help them keep workers on the payroll. The goal is to get these employees hired back or to get paid furlough to make sure that they have jobs to return to. This credit covers to 50% of the payroll on the first $10,000 of the compensation, including health benefits for each employee. For employers with more than 100 full-time employees, the credit is for the wage paid to employees where they are not benefiting services because of the coronavirus. Where they are not providing services because of the coronavirus. I didn't think that made sense. Eligible employees with 100 or fewer full-time employees could use the deduction even if they aren't closed. And kind of the main focus originally of this bill as a whole was the public health industry as a whole, as they were wanting to make sure to provide people, or not really people, but hospitals with the necessary equipment to help people who might have COVID-19, such as respirators and essentially hospitals themselves and hospital beds for the people who are sick. Lawmakers want to supplement community and private health systems to help meet the influx of new patients. There is $100 billion for hospitals responding to the coronavirus. Community health centers. The bill provides $1.32 billion in immediate additional funding for community centers that provide healthcare services for roughly 28 million people. Drug access. There is $11 billion for diagnosis, treatment, and vaccines. The bill also includes $80 million for the Drug and Food Administration to prioritize expedite approval of new drugs. So that's kind of the big thing and a lot of big talk. is what is the United States and what are states doing to flatten the curve of COVID-19 so that we don't become Italy in the amount of death rate that is coming from it. I believe the U.S. and most recently the doctors have talked about a death rate of under 1% or just above 1% so far for our United States, while in Italy it's more hovering around the 6 to 8% range as a whole, which is significantly higher than the United States. But the United States also hasn't had as much testing as Italy has had, and Italy has been overrun, and the United States hasn't really been overrun yet, but we could very well be that way once we actually get the test what we need to get done. So them being able to help the businesses as a whole is very important, and be able to help healthcare industry as a whole is very important as it needs to be done. But the most important thing is what's being done to flatten the curve before a vaccine gets made. As anyone who's seen the movie Contagion or any other kind of health or knows about how drugs are made, it is a very long process. And the process to make a vaccine isn't going to come just around the corner. So we need to figure out a way to flatten the curve until the vaccine comes into hand. And as we saw from the first article, once the vaccine actually comes out, they have a process made and a lot of money in order to get that vaccine to the people that need the vaccine and in general to people as a whole in order to protect them from the COVID-19. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC programs and response efforts are getting $4.3 billion. So the CDC is what comes up with the numbers and comes up with what we should do or what we should do to prevent COVID-19 from happening to us or from happening to your family, or general guidelines to what businesses and what you should do to protect yourself. So the CDC is the one that came up with the 6 feet rule and came up with there can only be 10 people tops in a building and social distancing. These are all kind of verbiage coming from President Trump, the CDC, and his doctors. But most importantly, as I've said, the CDC is what are making these efforts. So, and anybody who has watched TV in the recent months, well, not really recent month really, has seen the CDC ads all over the place. No matter what I'm watching, I feel like I'll see at least 1 or 2 of the CDC ads per 30 minutes of TV, or 3 or 4 per hour TV. They seem to come on quite frequently, and it's with President Trump's doctors or with someone from the CDC or someone who knows what they're talking about, telling you about these guidelines and telling you about what you should do or symptoms, and if you're having these symptoms, to call your local office and basically to get yourself tested if you can. So these ads are coming from the CDC and Disease Control Prevention, and it's very important that people know about these guidelines, and that's why these ads are getting played. But if you follow any sort of news or have access to the internet as a whole, you know about these guidelines and you know about the CDC. But again, this response effort is for everyone and not just for the people who have access. They're trying to figure out ways to get it to everybody. And recently, we got a postcard, I guess you could say, from the CDC about these guidelines posted on it. Although mail takes a lot longer than online media, not everybody has access to the online media, and that is why the CDC has taken efforts to send it through mail to make sure that everybody has heard about these guidelines. And obviously they need more money to keep going, so that one makes a lot of sense. Veterans healthcare. There is a $20 billion set aside for veterans. And this is the interesting one kind of here. Telehealth. The bill reauthorized a critical telehealth program to extend the reach of virtual doctor appointments. So telehealth is the process of getting diagnosed through telephone, and therefore you reduce the impact or the potential risk of showing up in person. And that's become important to protect the healthcare workers as a whole. And I know a lot of local clinics are doing telehealth, and I know people are experiencing it for the first time, and getting diagnosed through phone would seem rather odd. I haven't experienced myself, but I do think it's a little odd. But again, it reduces the risk and the contact of the sick person or the person who's in need of whatever they're in need of from possibly affecting the person giving the need or giving the drugs in the case of that. But I know that a lot of healthcare providers are also doing such as car tele things, or where they visit when they're staying in their car. So the healthcare industry is getting creative with how they are diagnosing patients and with keeping the average person healthy. Because it is important in a time where this mass sickness, what we don't know much about, is going around, to stay healthy as a whole. Because the chances are, if your body is healthy, you won't get the COVID-19 than if your body is semi-sick already, and then you're more likely to get it. But as a whole, because I believe the contact ratio for if someone has it is either 2 to 3 or 4 to 6. And basically that means, however, if that one person has it, he's most likely to affect 2 to 3 or 4 to 6. It's one of those numbers of patients. But either way, if a person has it and he's contacted you, the chances are high that at some point you have had a symptom of coronavirus or have had coronavirus. Medicine and supplies. The bill gives $16 billion to Strategic National Stockpile to increase the availability of equipment, including ventilators and masks. It also boosts hiring for vital healthcare jobs during the public health crisis and speeds the development of a vaccine, treatments, and faster diagnostics. The safety net. Child nutrition. There is the $8.8 billion to give schools more flexibility to provide meals for children. That was a highlight or an article I remember reading towards the very beginning of all this coronavirus help. Is it talked about how schools were giving poor people the access to food compared to what they had before. So in other words, when these students went to school, that is where they got their food, from the school, and not from any other means of getting the food. So the fact that they can't go to school anymore, they are now no longer getting the food and therefore getting malnourished, and that's not something we want to see as a whole. So giving them flexibility for meals for students is important, and I do remember reading an article about that very early on in this process. Food stamps. $15.5 billion is going to the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, also known as SNAP. The money will help cover the expected costs of the new application to the program as a result of the coronavirus. American Indian reservations, Puerto Rico, Northern Mariana Islands, and the American Samoa, I know I butchered that, all get additional funds and access to federal nutrition programs. Alrighty. Woo! We still got a little bit more to this, and then we'll try to get something a little lighter on the next article. Okay. State and local governments. The legislation designs $339.8 billion for programs that will go to state and local governments. It is divided up to put $274 billion towards specific COVID-19 response efforts, including $150 billion in direct aid for those state and local governments running out of cash because of the higher number of cases. It also includes $5 billion for community development block grants, $13 billion for K-12 schools, $14 billion for higher education, and $5.3 billion for programs, children, and families, including immediate assistance to child care centers, education, and other. Temporary student loan relief. We read about that. Work-study funds. It also allows schools to turn unused work-study funds into supplemental grants and continue paying work-study wages while schools are suspended. In other words, they're wanting to give wages to teachers, although teachers are no longer teaching in person. I know that the school I'm going to is going online, and although the teachers are still teaching through the online form, we are now no longer meeting in person, and therefore that impacts the teacher's ability to actually be able to teach the topic as a whole. And therefore, teachers I know are concerned about the money and if it's going to come or when it's going to come if they're not teaching. But the fact that it's moved to online has reduced a lot of those worries, but getting a working wage is still important to those who are in that field. Students who are forced to drop out. Students who drop out of school as a result of the coronavirus wouldn't have that time away from school deducted from their lifetime limits on substantive loan and Pell Grant eligibility. Those students will also not be asked to pay back any grants or other aid they have already received. In other words, if you have to drop out of school because you don't have access to these programs that the schools are now using in order to continue the schooling as a whole, you won't get as penalized for those issues as a whole. Because I know a lot of people, especially in the college that I go to, are a little bit worried about going online and how much their grades might suffer. And it's too late to really drop out of the class without any penalty because we're way over the halfway point overall in the class as a whole. And those who are in high school or in lower grades don't really have as much as a choice as someone who's in college because they're not really necessarily as in control as their education as a high schooler is when they're living with their parents or anything like that. So because of all this, it's important that we realize that schooling is still an important factor. So with these schools getting more money to supplement the growth and to continue the growth and to continue school is important to keep the economy going for whenever it picks back up. I'm going to check again real quick. Okay, we're still up here. Good. Alrighty. So excuse me. House passes a historic $2 trillion coronavirus economic rescue bill, and this is by TechCrunch.com. A massive bipartisan effort to receive relief to a U.S. economy on ice just leapt over its last major hurdle. On Friday, the House of Representatives passed a historic stimulus package known as the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, which contains an unprecedented $2.2 trillion in total financial relief for businesses and public institutions and individuals hit hard by the COVID-19 epidemic. The bill passed the House after Representative Thomas Massey took the unpopular step of blocking a voice vote that House members could conduct remotely. House lawyers quickly returned to Washington to appear in person Friday. And the representative went on to say, the aid must be robust, rapid, and resilient, just like its recipients, House Minority Leader Kevin McCaffrey said during the proceedings Friday. We are going to help America through this. We are going to do it together. Whatever concerns we may have and whatever we want to do next, right now we are going to pass the legislation, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said. And Nancy Pelosi is obviously the Democrat, if you followed any news recently, and is the House Speaker as a whole. To get the place of the first bipartisan consensus, the bill, shepherded by Treasury Secretary Stephen McCain, I think that's how you say it, came together through an additional rather than subtraction. The result is a sprawling 880-page piece of legislation stuffed with concessions for members of both parties, but one that can provide for Americans quickly. There are some of the key relief measures that targeted towards small businesses, big industry players, and a gutted American workforce reeling from the job loss. So again, I read this article more importantly because it talked about the rapid impact this bill has wanted to have. A lot of these representatives knew that Americans were struggling now and wanted to pass this bill in order to help Americans who are struggling now and to help them right away. And that's very important. And that's why this rapid amount of numbers we have heard with the 500 for an additional child, 600 for a week, 1,200. All these numbers we've heard over and over for this bill is getting those rapid financial aid faster than later in a crisis of need, when people are needing that money in order to pay the rent, in order to pay the electricity bill, in order to simply pay for food in some cases. Expanded unemployment benefits. After Democrats negotiated their own priorities into the bill, it now includes greatly boosted unemployment benefits that will reach workers usually left out in the code. Under the new legislation, gig workers, contract workers, and freelancers will now be eligible for unemployment businesses, a huge boom for anyone not employed full-time. The bill also includes a substantial additional $600 per week on top of the existing state benefits to help the jobless negative the crisis. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans had lost work as of mid-March, a number that's likely going up. That was a big thing that a lot of people have also talked about, and a lot of articles have talked about as a whole with the coronavirus. The coronavirus is a huge economic disaster in a large ways, and that is why of many reasons it's an epidemic as a whole. But one of the big reasons is because of the unemployment as a whole. So Trump, and very previously, was known for being able to increase the unemployment rate. In other words, he was having some of the best numbers we've seen in a large degree. But those numbers President Trump previously had are now abolished. Those numbers no longer exist. President Trump can no longer boost those numbers he once had. And that's huge, because now the unemployment rate is way worse than it was before. And that's because of the epidemic, but it's not necessarily a good thing by any means. And it's really made the economy struggle. And I'm not an economic insider, or not somebody who really knows much about economics as a whole, or about the stock market as a whole. It's something I would be interested in learning about, but it's not something I'm necessarily wanting to take time in learning about either, if that makes sense. Anyway, so it's very, very interesting that they're willing to give this fast aid to the people who are unemployed, and it's important because in order to have these people pay their rent and to pay for bills that are needed to be paid, and this money is one of those ways of how people are going to keep going, and that America is going to get over this epidemic as a whole. But it's also costing America a lot of money, and is a very potentially economically bad if people don't necessarily want to go back to work as a whole, as I kind of talked about earlier. And this is where I mentioned the Republican senator and then Bernie Sanders. So I'm going to read their exact words and what they said through this article, so you can kind of get their perspective fully on them without my interpretation in between. These benefits will last 4 months in spite of objections from Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who claimed the enhanced unemployment provisions could actually give some workers more money than they were making previously, a fact he said, and sensitize people to not go back to work. Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders slammed those obligations in a passionate speech on the Senate floor Wednesday night. Somebody who's making $12 an hour now, like the rest of us, faces an unappreciated economic crisis with $600 on top of their regular unemployment check, might be making a few bucks more for 4 months, Sanders said. Oh my word, will the universe survive? How absurd and wrong is that? So he was making fun of the idea that extra money is making people lazy, in other words, and that the amount of time the bill was going for with the 4 months was absurd, that Republican senators like Lindsey Graham thought were too long. And obviously, depending on where you align on the political spectrum, as I've said earlier, would make your decision up on who is right and who is wrong. And it's hard to tell as of now who exactly is going to be right and who exactly is going to be wrong on that issue, because we have never seen something this big before with the COVID-19. Small businesses can expect some relief. The bill set aside $350 billion for small business loans up to $10 million, with priority given to women-owned businesses, new businesses, and those run by anyone socially and economically disadvantaged. A separate $10 billion in emergency small business grants of up to $10,000 is also set aside, an unappreciated measure from the Small Business Administration. A separate $500 billion pool of money is set aside for bailing out larger businesses hurt by the crisis with emergency loans, a provision of the bill key to its Republican support. In recent days, Democrats were able to work in oversight measures for how that money gets allocated, provisions for an inspector general to oversee the process. The hard-hit airline industry will receive $58 billion from the pool of money, half in its loans and half in grants for worker pay. The loans come with some strings attached to them. Airlines will have to agree not to lay off workers through the end of September. The package forbids stock buybacks and issue dividends to shareholders for a year after paying off one of the loans. In other words, they're incentivizing airline industries to take the loan for a cheaper amount than normal, but they have to keep their employees on the payroll system. In other words, it would help keep employees working while the airline industry takes on some money as a whole in order to keep itself upright. In other words, they're wanting people to still work while the airline industry still gets money to keep doing its business and to keep afloat, because airline is obviously really important for economics as a whole. And as I said before, we don't want to just completely destroy the economy through just this one epidemic. Once this epidemic is away through a vaccine or through whatever issue or through the weather and its warmness and however the epidemic disappears, it's important that we then learn how to increase our economy to go forward, because the economy and jobs are really suffering now. And it's important that we realize that as a whole before it comes too late. And that's kind of what the bill is talking about. It's wanting to support the airline industry while still keeping people working. The bill also sets aside $100 billion for hospitals and health providers as they struggle to meet the challenge of COVID-19, aimed at widespread shortages of personal protective equipment and depleted staffs. In an effort to get companies to spend the money on workers rather than self-enrichment, the bill includes a ban on companies buying back their own stock or receiving help from the federal government and for 1 year afterward. Preventing companies to buying themselves when they're low is important. And obviously this bill had a lot of Republican type of legislation due to the fact that they don't want I'm not sure if it's considered Republican or Democrat legislation, but either way, it had a lot of legislation to make sure that people are still working through these rough times and that the corporation doesn't really make as much money as it could. So I guess you could say it's a Democrat perspective then, being very anti-corporation, but at the same time, they're still giving money to corporations to keep them upright. So I'm not really sure exactly where that stands. It may be a bipartisan, and that's a lot of what the bill needed to be, was bipartisan, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be bipartisan, that it is bipartisan, because it is politics. But anyway, back on track. One of the most surprising parts of the package is the bipartisan decision to include direct cash payments to Americans, a generally strongly Democratic idea with its roots in universal basic income proposals. Again, at the very beginning of my video, I kind of talked about how Andrew Yang's idea is the idea the government is going with for direct deposits and direct money and direct cash payments, as they're using the verbiage here. And that's very much what Andrew Yang was saying with the universal basic income that he talked about. Anyway, the stimulus will include direct cash payments of $1,200 for adults, $500 for children, and is more likely to go up 94% of all tax fillers, above an adjusted gross income of $75,000 for single flyers, and $150,000 for couples filling jointly. The payment phases out by $5 for every $100 in extra income. Single fillers without children making $99,000 and couples without children making $198,000 would receive no benefit. In spite of some Democrats pushing for recruiting payments, the benefit is a one-time payout. Though some in Congress expect additional payments to decide in the near future bills, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said she didn't think Congress has seen the end of direct payments. The payment will go directly to anyone who has received a tax refund through direct deposit in recent years. For everyone else, the government will be sending a check, a process that is expected to take longer. Some critics of the final bill wanted direct payments to circumvent the notoriously difficult to navigate U.S. tax system, but this is how they ended up. So all of those articles I might have read may have been slightly old if this one was to be true, and that's part of my confusion with this whole bill as a whole, because in a large degree, it's very hard to kind of understand all of the bill and all of its components around it, besides the very basic information you read on almost every article with the amounts of money Americans are going to receive from it if they qualify for the financial aid. And this is where I might have been previously wrong earlier, where I talked about this type of check system has never been done before, besides in one instance, but it wasn't at this big amount of mass. And I remember hearing that from a Ted Cruz video with Michael Knows, what he does on his channel. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but I'll link it in the description after this live stream is done, or in the comment section or whatever, when the live stream is done, about where I found the video and where he talked about it. But essentially it's talking about how this big of a buyback payment through the check process has only ever been done once, and the way it was done was not done at such a large impact as it's going to be done now. There is a lot of Americans who qualify for this financial aid and qualify for the COVID-19 response effort that hit them hard, such as restaurant employees who are now no longer in work. And even though it applies for people who are in work, like contractors and freelancers who might wash driveways or whatever, or paint houses and whatever else those jobs might be, where they aren't fully day-by-day type of jobs, such as a desk worker or a grocery store employee or whatever else you want to use, they're able to qualify for it as well, which is important to helping the Americans go forward in a time of crisis as a whole. And a lot of people have talked about how that may not be a smart thing long term, but it's something they seem to be very focused on getting that financial aid right away instead of later. And I don't have too much longer before I'll get to some lighter stuff towards the end of the video. But this is the article where I talked about at the beginning, where that it was a corporation dream type of bill. And the NPR article kind of had the estimated breakdown of how the bill was going to go. And corporations were number 2 behind individuals in that breakdown that NPR had. And this Reason.com article's headline reads, "The Senate COVID-19 relief bill is a corny capitalist dream." So in other words, it's talking about how they gave too much finance or too much money to the corporations, and it should have been focused on small businesses or whatever else it should have been focused on. But we'll read the article and see kind of where it talks about. Unanimous corporations in Congress, after a day of performative fusing and fighting over the partisan particulars in the COVID-19 relief bill, U.S. senators last night passed 96-0. The $2 trillion spending measure largely unchanged. The part getting the most attention is the direct payments of $1,200 each for single Americans who made under $75,000. Dual-income married couples under $450,000. We've heard these numbers before, and I don't think I'll need to repeat them again. As I talked about earlier, these are the numbers I kept seeing when I was researching this idea for the live stream, as I didn't want to just read these articles with the first time ever seeing them. And that doesn't really make much sense to me. But I kept seeing the same sort of information on every single article, which is good for consistency, but it wasn't a detailed information outlook for what the bill exactly includes. The bill is 880 pages long, yet it was only talking about like 4 things that were in the bill, and that was the amount of money. Yes, it's the first thing that's going to happen, and it's the thing that most directly affects Americans. It isn't 800 pages of what the bill was, and that was kind of getting on my nerves. But I was able to find a little more information and kind of go from there. But again, I'll read. Do you trust politicians to make investment decisions with your children's future? Tweeted Libertarian Party Chairman Nicholas Sharwark, I probably butchered that, who has been fiercely critical of business bailouts. Each American would be on the hook for over $6,000 in debt for those investments. But it's the businesses that will receive the rewards. Say no to the socialist bailouts of corporate cronies. Libertarian-leaning Representative Justin Amish, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe Justin Amish was Republican and switched to independent not that long ago, and it kind of became a big thing, and he was one of the people I voted no in the impeachment, or voted yes, and I believe, I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure he was the one who switched. Anyway, back on topic. Has also been hitting this theme. Neither Congress nor the Treasury Secretary should be picking winners and losers, Amish tweeted on Tuesday. Corporate welfare is not the only unjust, but also reflects the government conceit. I don't think I said that right. Anyway, only consumers, not politicians, can appropriately determine which companies deserve to succeed. If Democrats and Republicans are going to spend $2 trillion, then the best way to do it is by far a direct cash transfer that otherwise keeps the government out of the way, he wrote yesterday. That is the bottom line for me. In other words, he's talking about how individuals should receive the money directly instead of corporations as a whole. And corporations getting the money is non-American because these certain corporations who are in the bill, or the certain corporations that are in the bill, most effectively will get the money. And what I mean by the quotations is just because the corporation isn't said in writing doesn't mean that that corporation was put in writing in the bill. In other words, just because it doesn't say Amazon for taxes doesn't mean that they weren't thinking of Amazon when they wrote that certain tax policy to have Amazon not pay taxes. And that has been a large debate for that sort of sector as well. And again, as I've said, their perspective is that these corporations shouldn't be the main focus of the video, or shouldn't be a focus at all in the video compared to the individual and the person who is most affected in this epidemic. After the Senate vote last night, this is Amish's pinned tweet. And they cheered because leaders assured them that the corporation was good and necessary and bipartisan. The Libertarian Party has been appealing to the House to fix the Senate mess. We asked the representatives who plan to vote to Senate by hashtag stimulus bill by Friday, from conservatives like Representative Thomas Massey to progressives like AOC to independents like Justin Amash, cut the nonsense in this bill. Use it to responsibly help people and send it back to the Senate. So that was a large topic as a whole before the bill got passed, and even when the bill got passed, because the Libertarian Party, although it's not the large party, it's the largest third party America has as a whole, and America has never really had a super strong third party. I wrote an article about that not too long ago that I talked about all of what's qualified to become a third party, and that was just in the state of Texas, to become like a senator or a representative of Texas. And it takes a lot to be a third-party candidate, and that's even getting enough votes to even qualify for the third party itself. So in other words, America is very much against having a third party, but third parties still have a perspective in the whole thing as a whole, so their perspective is still valid. And it talks about how coronavirus was in prison and jails. I'm not so much focused on that, but I'm more focused about what exactly is in the bill as a whole. So I'll move on from there. But if you are interested in that perspective, you can read the follow-up tab of the article from Reason, and I'll have it linked in my description or in my comments later on once I get finished. So I thought I would kind of talk about this Hill article as I'm not really too brushed up on the topic as a whole, and I was interested to see the perspective from it as a whole. Anyway, students with disabilities could lose with COVID-19 stimulus package. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is the nation's federal special education law. It provides funding, technical assistance, and monitoring to ensure students with disabilities receive a free, appropriate education. With the new COVID-19 stimulus package, the U.S. Congress will provide Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos with the right to provide waivers to states for the IDEA implementation. As a researcher in the area of educational policy, I think that this is extremely concerning. If DeVito's past behavior has any predicament value for her future decisions related to the inqualient educational policies, the families of children with disabilities across the country could also be highly concerned. During DeVito's Senate confirmation hearings 3 years ago, she struggled to respond to the basic question posted by Senator Tim Kaine about special education. She was asked whether schools that receive tax dollars should be required to meet IDEA requirements, to which she replied, "I think that is a matter that's best left for the states. Under federal law, the Department of Education is responsible for monitoring IDEA compliance. Texas serves as a perfect example of why federal oversight is critical. Recently, the Department of Education found that Texas created a policy that delayed or denied special education to eligible students who are also in violation of a federal statute prohibiting states from reducing funding for students with disabilities from year to year. Additionally, just last year, a federal judge ruled that the Department of Education's delay of the rule that required states to address racial disproportionality in a special education was illegal. The Obama-era rule required districts to address the policies and practices that led to significant disparity in special education for students of color. The Department of Education also planned to eliminate 29 programs and slash $17.6 million in funding for Special Olympics in 2020's budget. U.S. Representative Mark Bocane asked whether she knew how many students would be affected. DeVos replied, "I don't know the number of kids." The budget also included millions of dollars in cuts in the Helen Keller National Center for Deaf, Blind Youths and Adults, the American Printing House for the Blind, and the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. This country is now facing extreme challenges dealing with the COVID-19, and states and districts will need to be flexible and to support in providing education to students with disabilities. Still, leadership and credibility to make decisions are lacking. Congress needs to reconsider providing DeVos with the power to grant waivers to IDEA implementation. Families need to join in solidarity with disability advocates and educators and demand special education remain intact and stimulus money is directed towards preventing disruption of services. So it goes on and on, talking a little bit more about IDEA and DeVos' past reputation as a whole. But I thought it was rather interesting to kind of end the main topic and articles on the COVID-19 bill as a whole on that. Because, again, I don't think that disabilities with the COVID-19 is getting talked about that much. And the fact that people with disabilities in schools, or in other words, could get affected more from this stimulus package is rather concerning in a large degrees, because it is a population that is at target a lot and doesn't really get respected as much as they probably should be within this situation as a whole, as special education is very important to me as I'm considering going into the field as a special education teacher as a whole. So I thought that was rather interesting if that were to be true. And I don't know much about DeVos, and I don't know much about the Department of Education and Special Education fully as a whole, as I haven't fully pursued that topic as a whole, but it's something to keep an eye on. So there are two sites that have this CARES Act in full, and as I've said, it's 880 pages long, and just by reading the articles, what kind of talk about the main points and the points we kept hearing over and over again in order to kind of try to understand this bill, we know that these 880 pages were not covered by any of these articles as much as they probably should have been, or they were thought to be. In other words, out of the 880 topics, or 880 pages, only a few of the highlights were actually talked about and actually covered when you have this many sections to the bill. As you can see here, I have a website that Ed gave to me when I kind of talked about how I was struggling to find information for the bill. And Ed is Ed's World, and he has a YouTube channel, and he does a daily live stream that kind of goes over the news. In other words, anyway, I'll link his channel below, but I think you should highly join his channel, subscribe to his channel, or watch his channel. And also, he runs the website Freedom Scoop that I'm a part of. But anyway, long story short, he gave me this website what kind of broke things down into subtopics as a whole. And obviously, this live stream is already run a little long, and I don't think that I'll have enough time or enough availability to look into everything or into some parts of the bill as a whole. But if you like this, I'll go more into detail with these subtopics and click on a few of these tabs and kind of break down the bill as much as I can from now on. And again, I might make a shorter video on that with not a live stream, or I might make a live stream about it. I'm not exactly sure. I might see who's interested in that, or if there is interest as a whole. But I'll link this in the description if you're curious on looking at a more detailed perspective from the bill itself, such as when you click for like grants for short term, you'll get that exact topic and where it comes from in the bill as a whole. But I thought I would end this video with something semi-related to COVID-19, but more on a lighter note as a whole. So, we all know this person, especially if you watch TV or follow any culture. If you're into any sort of celebrities, you know of this person as a whole, as the United States culture as a whole is into celebrities. But anyway, he's a celebrity chef, and it's Gordon Ramsay. And obviously, when you say celebrity chef, you probably think of Gordon Ramsay as one of the first names that comes to your mind. But he kind of got a lot of crap, I guess you could say, for firing a lot of his employees. So I'll read from this article. It says, "Piece of shit, Gordon Ramsay fired over 500 employees overnight." And I'll read, "Celebrity chef Gordon Ramsay is facing backlash after terminating 500 contracts overnight due to ongoing coronavirus pandemic. It was announced that Gordon's restaurant will temporarily close. Now workers are seeking out and angry over the abrupt decision while Ramsay stays silent." Gordon Ramsay leaves over 500 employees jobless due to coronavirus. Celebrity chef Gordon Ramsay recently took action and closed the line of restaurants due to ongoing coronavirus pandemic. During a meeting, employees working at Ramsay's restaurants were given the bad news. One of those workers spoke directly to the Metro, saying, "We had a meeting Friday and head-on street kitchen where they have told us that our contracts, we are terminated. And he said that because of the situation that they have to close the restaurant and terminate all our contracts. One more sec. The source also added that Gordon never spoke to any of the employees directly. He just sent one of his directors who was affected emotionally by the situation as well. They added, although Ramsey took interest in issuing his staff with the update directly, he did take it to Instagram to praise them. Huge love and thanks to our amazing staff across the restaurants for all the passion and support. I truly hope we all go back together very soon, the chef wrote. Unfortunately for Gordon, we find it hard to believe that many will return after this. We must give the TV chef some credit, however. Excuse me. A spokesperson for Gordon Ramsay restaurant issued a statement to Mail Online regarding the sudden closures and termination of staff contracts. Gordon Ramsay restaurants is continuing to work tirelessly and expeditionally, unappreciatively, globally circumstances to ensure that as many employees as possible are being retained by the business. Many have spoken in anger over Ramsay's decision on Twitter, which led the TV chef to trend #1 on the platform. The tweet below details that bosses with far less money are sticking by their staff, even going as far as keeping them on with their own money. As Mark Cunliffe said, unlike Gordon Ramsay, I am keeping my staff on my own money. P.S. I am not worth 140 million euros. I have so many swear words I could use right now, but won't this pricker who has made a fortune from swearing on TV? So that's kind of a big topic as a whole. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, Gordon Ramsay is probably the most famous celebrity chef as a whole, and therefore he's kind of getting a lot of flack for what he has done from that situation as a whole. But a later article I was going to end with talks about Gordon Ramsay again, as it says Gordon Ramsay fires back, calling critic bitter and nostalgical after he fires 500 staff members. Gordon Ramsay caught himself in a controversy recently after firing 500 staff overnight due to coronavirus fears. The chef reportedly terminated the contracts of staffs working in restaurants that now closed due to the pandemic. Ramsay has now opened to the controversy surrounding his decisive decision to terminate the contracts of over 500 staff members overnight. This came after Gordon Ramsay restaurant put out a statement that they were temporarily closing. When restaurant critic Mario Olatario took a hit at Ramsay's decision on Twitter, it wasn't long before Gordon fiercely responded. You have clearly never ran a business, and yet across they are very difficult times for all. You hide beneath your pathetic tweets. Get a grip, will you? Cheap shots again, and again from a bitter, egotistical critic. Yawn, tweets Ramsay in response. The TV chef didn't stop there, choosing to take a fire at the critic's journalism career. You complain about food for a living. Close the restaurants with your poison pen because they didn't kiss your ass. Ever thought about giving back across these difficult times? I have nothing but my hands in my pockets for years, continued Ramsay. We aren't kidding. Gordon Ramsay will. This was talking about how he was going to take drugs in his most recent in his most recent cooking video with Gordon, Gino, and Fred's road trip, as it talks about here. And I guess since I already talked about it, I'll keep going. Gordon Ramsay takes drugs in his latest episode of his television series. We weren't kidding. Gordon Ramsay will routinely reunite with his cooking companions in this hilarious TV show featuring Gino DiGarapio and Fred Schreiber. This time, the trio will take to the American highways, trying everything the U.S. has to offer. Gino explained that the particular segment of the show involves the trio trying marijuana with food. I mean, we did a lot of insane things, but on this day, first, we went to a place where you can eat marijuana legally. So you sample the taste of it with food, says DiMacchio. We can't speak for everyone, but this is surely bound to be TV gold, as I could imagine it will be. So a lot of people have kind of taken flack at Gordon Ramsay because he is kind of the celebrity chef persona, and a lot of his TV shows have become very popular, like Hell Kitchen. But the restaurant industry is getting hit very hard. As we have our local Tillman Fertitta, I believe is how you pronounce his name, of Houston and of Texas, who's fired a lot of, or not fired, who has furloughed a lot of his employees that work at his numerous restaurants that he owns. And it's become very saddening for Tillman Fertitta and other restaurant owners as a whole. And many local restaurant businesses or local businesses as a whole have either had to furlough or fire their employees in a time where they don't really want to, but they have to in order to survive. Anyway, thank you for watching my live stream, as this is the first one I've ever done. Hopefully you enjoyed it at least a little bit. And if I'll be interested to see if you'll kind of like a further breakdown of the bill directly. I'm not sure if that's something that a lot of people are going to be necessarily super interested in. And if not, I might not do a live stream on it. I might just do a smaller video. But anyway, I'll kind of like to see if you kind of like the idea of that or not, or if there are any other kind of live stream topics you would want me to talk about as a whole. But again, I thank you for watching, and catch me next time. In stream.